December 22nd, 1944. The frozen forests around Bastogne, Belgium. Through the morning fog, 4 German soldiers approach the American lines. They are not attacking. They carry a white flag. They are a formal truce party, bearing a typed document for the commander of the surrounded 101st Airborne Division. For the Americans, it is the 6th day of the siege. Ammunition is low, medical supplies are nearly gone, and the winter cold is relentless. From the German perspective, the offer they carry is not a threat. It is a logical, honorable end to a hopeless fight. The fate of 11,000 men now hangs on the reply. The American commander's reply would become one of the most famous single words of the war, a symbol of defiance against impossible odds. But this was not simply a moment of spontaneous bravery. It was a calculated act of psychological warfare, crafted in a moment of extreme pressure. This is the story of how that reply was born, and what it truly communicated to the enemy. It forces a fundamental question. When you are surrounded, outnumbered, and your situation appears hopeless, what is the strategic value of absolute, almost irrational, refusal? To find the answer, we must first understand the reality of the trap closing around Bastogne. Just 6 days earlier, the men of the 101st Airborne Division were not even in the fight. They were 140 miles away in Mourmelon, France, resting and absorbing replacements after the brutal campaign in Holland. They were a strategic reserve, not a frontline unit. But on December 16th, Hitler's last great gamble of the war, a massive armored offensive through the Ardennes forest, shattered the Allied front. The 101st was thrown into trucks and rushed toward the sound of the guns with little more than the ammunition in their pockets. Their destination was Bastogne, a small Belgian market town, unremarkable except for one critical fact. It was a hub, a carrefour, where 7 major roads converged. For the German panzers to maintain their momentum westward toward the Meuse River, they had to control these roads. And to control the roads, they had to take Bastogne. By December 20th, the 101st and a handful of other American units had formed a defensive perimeter. By the 21st, German armored and infantry divisions had slammed the door shut behind them. They were completely surrounded. The siege had begun. Then, a second enemy arrived, the weather. A dense, freezing fog descended on the Ardennes, swallowing the landscape. It was a suffocating, bone-chilling blanket that grounded the Allied air forces. This was more than a tactical inconvenience. It was a logistical death sentence. No fighter bombers could attack the German positions, and more critically, no C-47 transport planes could fly in supplies. The men in the foxholes were not yet starving. They had their K-rations, but the defensive Bastogne was bleeding out in other, more vital ways. In the main aid station, surgeons were running out of plasma, morphine, and bandages for the hundreds of wounded. The division's artillery was being slowly silenced. With no resupply, ammunition for the howitzers was rationed to an agonizing 10 rounds per gun per day. Gunners were ordered to fire only on targets they could see, and only with direct command approval. They were losing the ability to break up German attacks before they began. The perimeter was a porous ring of isolated strongpoints, a donut-shaped defense in the fog. Every day, the Americans could hear the clatter and rumble of German tanks moving freely on the roads they were supposed to be defending, a constant auditory reminder of their isolation. The pressure was not that of a single massive assault, but of a slow, inexorable squeeze. Into this grinding battle of attrition, the arrival of the German truce party on the morning of December 22nd was a sudden break in the routine of survival. It wasn't another artillery barrage or a probe of the line. It was a question. It presented a choice that was not about the next foxhole, but about the fate of the entire battle. The 2 German officers were led blindfolded past the American foxholes to the command post of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment. There they presented their formal demand. It was not a hastily scribbled note, but 2 typed copies, one in German, one in English. The message was from General der Panzertruppe Heinrich von Lüttwitz, commander of the 47th Panzer Corps, the force tasked with taking Bastogne. The text was professional, almost clinical. It laid out the facts as the Germans saw them. Bastogne was completely encircled by strong, armored units, and further American resistance was pointless. It offered a stark choice, an honorable surrender to save the U.S. troops from total annihilation and prevent the further suffering of the town's civilians. The ultimatum was not a negotiation. It was a final offer, with a deadline. The American commander had 2 hours to reply. The note was rushed by jeep to the division's command post in the Heinz barracks. For the American staff, this was a fundamental shift. The problem was no longer how to repel the next probe or conserve the next box of ammunition. The problem was now a single, binary choice with irreversible consequences. Surrender and save the lives of thousands of men, but cede the strategic crossroads that was the entire reason they were here. Or refuse, and condemn those same men to a fight they were rapidly losing the material means to wage. The ultimatum was placed in the hands of the division's operations officer, Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kennard. He walked down the hall to the sleeping quarters of the acting commander. After days of relentless crisis management, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe had finally been convinced to get some rest. Now, Kennard had to wake him with the news that the enemy was no longer asking for a battle. They were demanding a surrender. General McAuliffe, pulled from a rare moment of sleep, read the German ultimatum. He glanced over the carefully worded paragraphs promising annihilation. According to everyone in the room, his reaction was not a calculated speech for the history books. It was immediate, spontaneous, and laced with the weary frustration of a commander under siege. He looked at the paper, a formal invitation to his own defeat, and uttered a single, exasperated phrase. "Aw, nuts." He crumpled the document and tossed it on the floor. For McAuliffe, the German offer wasn't a serious dilemma. It was a distraction, an absurdity. He had a battle to run. The immediate problem was how to get more ammunition for the 502nd Parachute Infantry, not how to surrender. He told his staff he was going back to thank the soldiers on the front line for their work, leaving them to deal with the paperwork. But the Germans were waiting. The 2-hour deadline was ticking. McAuliffe's staff, men like his intelligence officer, Lieutenant Colonel Paul Danahy, and his operations officer, Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kennard, gathered to formulate the official reply. They began debating the proper military language for rejecting a surrender demand. A formal, multi-point response seemed appropriate, something that would be recorded in the annals of military history. They discussed citing international law, or perhaps delivering a defiant statement about the American fighting spirit. Yet, every draft felt wrong. A lengthy, formal rejection would implicitly grant the German ultimatum a legitimacy it didn't deserve. It would elevate the German demand to a serious negotiation, when the American command saw it as an insulting bluff. The staff was stuck. It was then, according to the men present, that Harry Kennard had an idea. He turned to the others and said, "That first remark of yours would be hard to beat." The room fell silent for a moment, and then the idea took hold. McAuliffe's initial, unscripted outburst, "Nuts," was the perfect reply. It was short, it was dismissive, it was uniquely, unapologetically American. It treated the enemy's grand ultimatum with the contempt they felt it deserved. The decision was made. They would send that one word. A formal military document had to be created. Private First Class Ernest Palfy, a clerk in the divisional headquarters, was summoned to a typewriter. He was given a simple, almost surreal instruction. On a clean sheet of paper, he typed out the message that would be delivered to the waiting German delegation. It was addressed to the German commander. Below that, centered on the page, a single word, "Nuts," and at the bottom, the signature, "The American Commander." In that moment, a spontaneous exclamation of frustration was codified into an official act of war. A curse had become a command. The task of delivering this bizarre piece of military correspondence fell to Colonel Joseph "Bud" Harper of the 327th Glider Infantry. He and his driver took the typed note back to the forward aid station where the German truce party was being held. Harper handed the paper to the German captain. The Germans unfolded the note. They read the single word, and they were utterly baffled. This was not in any military textbook. It wasn't a yes, a no, or a counterproposal. It was gibberish. The German captain looked up at Harper, his face a mask of confusion. "Was ist das?" he asked. "Is this a negative reply?" He explained that they did not understand the word's meaning or its context. Colonel Harper, cold, tired, and with no patience left for diplomatic niceties, provided the necessary translation. "In plain English," he said, "it means, go to hell." To remove any lingering ambiguity, he added a stark warning. If the Germans continued to send men forward to ask for surrender, the Americans would be forced to kill them. The message was now unmistakably clear. The Americans were not just refusing to surrender, they were insulting the very idea. The story of the reply spread through the American lines faster than any official communique. For the exhausted, freezing soldiers in their foxholes, it was an electrifying jolt of morale. It was proof that their leaders were not considering surrender. "Nuts" became a password, a joke, a rallying cry. It was a defiant symbol that even though they were surrounded and outgunned, they were still in the fight. It gave them a psychological edge, a shared identity as the stubborn bastards who had told a German general to go to hell. But on the other side of the line, the reaction was precisely the opposite. For General von Luttwitz and his superior, the commander of the 5th Panzer Army, General Hasso von Manteuffel, the ultimatum had been a professional courtesy. It was an honorable offer, standard military procedure to prevent the needless slaughter of an entrapped force. The American reply was not seen as brave or defiant. It was seen as a profound, arrogant insult. It broke the unwritten rules of engagement between professional officers. The German command's response was immediate and furious. The flippant American note was taken as proof that the defenders of Bastogne were not rational soldiers to be defeated, but arrogant fools to be annihilated. General von Luttwitz immediately ordered an intensification of the assault. The artillery bombardment that had already been punishing the American lines was to be redoubled. Preparations were to be made for an all-out, coordinated attack to crush the town once and for all. The word had been sent. The insult had been delivered, and now the consequences were coming. As the thunder of German artillery began to swell across the frozen fields, the defense of Bastogne was no longer a matter of words. The Americans had won a battle of wills, but in doing so, they had triggered a battle of annihilation. The defiant word did not silence the German guns. It provoked them. As promised, General von Luttwitz ordered the heaviest bombardment yet. All through the evening and night of December 22nd, artillery hammered the American perimeter with a new intensity. For the men in the foxholes, the bravado of the reply was a distant echo, drowned out by the immediate reality of steel and high explosives. The Germans were preparing the final assault, determined to make good on their promise of annihilation. But as dawn broke on December 23rd, the battlefield began to change in a way no general could command. For the first time in nearly a week, a pale sun began to burn through the oppressive gray ceiling. The thick, freezing fog that had blinded the Allies and shielded the Germans started to dissipate. The sky over Bastogne was clearing. This was the miracle they had been praying for. A clear sky meant the 9th Air Force could fly. It meant the starving artillery batteries could finally be resupplied. It meant the hundreds of wounded might finally get plasma and bandages. And then they heard it. A new sound, cutting through the rumble of battle. Not the familiar clatter of panzers or the whistle of incoming shells. It was a deep, steady drone from above, the sound of friendly engines. The sky was no longer empty. At 9:30 a.m. on December 23rd, the drone became a roar. Out of the blue winter sky came the first wave of C-47 Skytrains, hundreds of them. The sky above Bastogne blossomed with parachutes, green, red, and yellow, each color designating its precious cargo. For the first time in a week, the defenders were getting what they needed most: 155mm artillery shells to answer the German guns, plasma and surgical kits for the wounded, and K-rations for everyone. But the C-47s were not alone. With the transports came the Hunters. P-47 Thunderbolts, the paratroopers' flying artillery, were unleashed. For days, the Americans had been helpless spectators to German movement. Now, the Thunderbolts dove on the panzer columns and troop concentrations, their .50 caliber machine guns and 500-pound bombs shattering the enemy's sense of security. For the German command, the clear sky was a catastrophe. Their advantage was gone. Enraged, and knowing their window of opportunity was closing, they prepared to make good on their promise of total annihilation. On Christmas Day, they threw everything they had left at the American perimeter. Panzer Grenadiers, supported by tanks, stormed the western and northwestern sectors in the most concentrated, furious assault of the entire siege. This was the physical test. The abstract defiance of nuts was now being paid for in the concrete currency of desperate, close-quarters combat. The final bill for that single word had come due. The Americans held. On Christmas Day, they threw back the German assault. The next day, the tanks of Patton's 4th Armored Division finally broke the siege, ending the ordeal. This returns us to the fundamental question. In a situation that appeared hopeless, what was the strategic value of that absolute, contemptuous refusal? Let's be clear. The word nuts did not stop a single panzer. The defense of Bastogne was materially saved by the clearing weather, the critical airdrops of supplies, and the eventual arrival of the relieving army. The reply's true importance was psychological. By rejecting the very premise of surrender, McAuliffe accomplished two critical objectives. For his own men, he instantly removed surrender as a mental possibility. The mission became brutally simple: resist. For the enemy, he projected an image of irrational confidence that sowed doubt, forcing the German command to question their own intelligence, to wonder what the Americans knew that they didn't. It was a masterclass in command, proving that in the fog of war, a leader's most powerful weapon can be the ability to shape the narrative of the fight itself. The defense of Bastogne was ultimately secured by the material of war, by air power, by artillery shells, and by armored divisions. But it was defined, and will forever be remembered, by a single word. A word that possessed no tactical value on its own, yet proved to be priceless.